Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. Joining us now, Drew Mikhael. He is a scholar at the Center for the Study of Ethnic Conflict at Queen's University, Belfast. Frequent guest on TMBS. I know that Michael first reached out to you. What was it? You reached out to him on Twitter, or he reached out and you reached out to him? Tell us why.
Yes.
Like, what was it about Michael that you thought, like, oh, okay, I can. This is, and we should say, obviously, you're a professor, and you work in conflict resolution. What was it about Michael that you thought was worth connecting with?
Well, I'll give a shout out to my brother here because he's the one who turned me on to your show initially. So it wasn't TMBS first, it was the Majority Report. And he suggested, knowing that I'm not a great listener or watcher of podcasts, that, look, there's a really smart guy who's giving great commentary in the Middle East. Normally this would be enough to turn me off, but I took a listen, and obviously all you guys are great for a start. But particularly Michael's expertise in presenting a non-Orientalist view of American foreign policy in the Middle East. Obviously, he spent time there in Turkey, but more than that, and again, credit to your show, is the humor, right? Because I think that oftentimes that we work in very serious environments, at least I know I do, and a bit of humor and levity is really, really important for my day job. So hearing the impressions, particularly the critique of Sam Harris, who at that point I was working a lot with de-radicalization work, and in 2014 to 2016, there was a lot of work on the Muslim problem with Daesh or ISIS in the Middle East, and hearing some pushback in the American mainstream media or the leftist media was really, really important. So I reached out to him and sent him a couple of articles that I had written based on my research, and one that I wrote with a co-author in the Washington Post about how radicalization happens. At that point, he spun on in conversation and then eventually meeting up and becoming friends.
And we should say, like, 2014, 2015 was like Sam Harris's Islam is the mother lode of bad ideas era. And of course, you know, Michael went on to write a book about the IDW, which was sort of the construction of what Sam Harris was sort of doing was sort of very similar, sort of like providing some type of intellectual cover for really sort of just reactionary and some of the oldest sort of bigotry and prejudice and I guess salutations to the hierarchy that you could find, but it was all repackaged. But let's talk about that, and particularly in the context of cosmopolitan socialism. We haven't talked about that, but that, to the extent that, you know, one can speculate as to where Michael was going and sort of from where he was, like he was really invested in this idea, and it's not, you don't really hear it referenced. You don't hear the words cosmopolitan socialism thrown around that often, unless sometimes it's like an attack on some level, or used as an attack. Explain to us your understanding of what cosmopolitan socialism is and sort of Michael's idea of it.
Well, I'll jump on. I just want to reference one thing that you said about the Harris critique. The fact is, one thing that stands above all is that it's intellectually boring and ill-read and poorly constructed, ahistorical, asociological. And I think that this was the kernel from certainly my interactions with Michael, and he had a lot of better, greater minds influencing him and talking to him on the regular basis. But my influence or my conversations with him were very much centered around pushing back that, or looking for integration, as it were, looking to sort of understand the composite whole of different systems that we want to critique and replace, different people who manifest or represent those systems, as you just said, who repackage themselves into American foreign policy or construction of power overseas, and to really provide not only a critique, but a viable alternative for understanding the world, for engaging with it, for seeing the problems rooted not only in our own societies, and this is where the cosmopolitan element for me comes in, seeing the problems of homelessness or the problems of destitution or the problems of the failing capitalist economy in the US, seeing how they manifest elsewhere. And particularly in October 2019, I sent Michael a couple of videos on WhatsApp in the middle of the Thawra protest in Lebanon, which was close to a metaphor for late-stage capitalism as I can think of, the worst economic collapse of the last 150 years, according to the World Bank. I said, look, this is actually in a state that is divided, that has historically been divided along ethno-religious lines. We had a great coming together in October 2019. And this sort of represents that hope of cosmopolitanism reaching beyond petty differences or instrumentalized differences of historical violent division, and actually setting us on a path of quite frankly, economic, social justice as well. And I think that with Michael's early forays into writing, because we know that he was an excellent public speaker, he was excellent at engaging with the work on an auditory level. I think that, it's the next step was really trying to crystallize some of those ideas on the page. Something that another scholar or another polemicist could take in another part of the world and really run with some of those ideas for their own context to hopefully draw together a wider, more unitary direction of travel for left-wing politics.
That idea of instrumentalized divisions, I think, is one that is really interesting. Will you tease that out for us a little bit, insofar as, like, it doesn't mean that these differences aren't real. It's just that there are multiple different approaches society can take to differences, and in some very, it's just a question of who gets there first, I guess, and what's in their best interests. Will you just tease that out for us?
Yeah, and I will apologize for any overly academic language that I might use. I'll try to temper it as best as possible, but in the majority of cases that I work, Great Lakes, East Africa, across the Middle East, particularly Iraq, Lebanon, Burundi, I work in states that have suffered quite a lot of what we would call ethnic conflict, right? For the lack of a better term, it's not always ethnic. It could be religious, could be class. And in the post years of the cessation of violence, you see the same elites most often represented who were part of the warring class or who are leaders in violence, continuing to move up into political position. And these elites, and when I say instrumentalize, often create their own constituencies around whatever ethnic, we'll use for the shorthand, ethnic borders or ethnic groups that they have, so they can secure their own position in the fauna of the polity, right? They want to maintain their position, privileged position, where they can get access to resource, access to wealth. They can continue to lead their own ethnic constituency many generations down the line. And you don't need to go to East Africa and the Middle East to see it. You can see it in Northern Ireland as well. You can see it in post-conflict states in the global economic north. And the way that you replicate this power is by instrumentalizing and fostering those ethnic differences, those differences that people may have, as you said, rightly have a kernel of truth in difference in the political and social outlook of certain groups. I mean, sorry to use the crude terms, but like we can say Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland see how the state of Northern Ireland differently. There's a genuine concern and legitimacy on both sides of that argument. But what the ethnic elites do is try to foster those divisions as much as possible to keep the options, the political options, as narrow as possible so the divisions remain salient. And in that saliency, they can continue to use the state apparatus to create clientelistic networks, to embed their own power, and to secure their own political futures, to the detriment of the overall political program of the state and continuing divisions in them. And you see this repeated throughout.
How much of that paradigm is applicable, at least in terms of like the dynamics that you're talking about, to something like anything from, I don't know, January 6th in this country, or I mean, Jim Crow in the wake of the Civil War. I mean, it seems like that dynamic, or even in the context of, I just, in the wake of 9/11, and to compare and contrast like what George W. Bush was doing, I had just happened to go to Cuba and watching like the way that Castro was. I just remember a statue of shoot, I can't remember who it was. There's a statue out in front of the U.S. annex where I can't remember his name, but he was a like one of the founding fathers of Cuba, holding Elian and Gonzalez, obviously time and space, but the idea of creating outside nationalism on some level, functioning in the same way that ethnicity or race or whatnot, religion can function. How much of that paradigm is applicable to these different areas?
100% applicable. And I've discussed this with other scholars of U.S. politics who there's quite I get quite uneasy because oftentimes a lot of the states in which I work have been characterized in the literature as deeply divided, right? And I think that, again, scooting over the crudeness of that term, who's to say that the increased division within U.S. politics doesn't start to resemble a deeply divided society, right? We can draw those lines across different regions. Again, I'm not an expert in U.S., so I'll leave that to you. But certainly in the conversations that I've had, that you can see the instrumentalization, the drawing of hardened, crystallized boundaries over what it means to be a member of the U.S. state, right? And this doesn't have to be along ethnic terms, although I think that if we were to look at the nationalistic fervor and discourse created in the U.S. around January 6th, and ethnic racial differences, we'd probably see a Venn diagram that would, would probably align in a lot of different ways.
Yes.
So historically, obviously, we've seen, as you've mentioned, the Jim Crow era. We've seen civil rights. We've seen a large, longitudinal movement within the U.S. that has created a state that is eager to include certain individuals, but not others. And oftentimes when we see instrumentalization by political elites, they hearken back to those golden era moments of when the state was great, or the problem with the state now is that we've let other people in and it was much simpler and much easier whenever we were able to fully control the different functions. So yes, there are tremendous overlaps, because the reality is that these types of tactics aren't greatly original and they're not greatly varied. So you do see the repeating of them across time and space and boundaries as well. They're not temporally or borderly locked. And unfortunately, you do see the outcrop of what happens whenever a leader decides to, instead of creating a unified paradigm, they create a narrow one, and then you start to see increased division and polarization.
I want to ask, I mean, I have a sense, and I think maybe our audience does at this point too, but what do you think that Michael was most interested about your work? I mean, and to what extent did he want a solution to that, like how you address that instrumentalization of these differences?
Obviously, it wouldn't shock your audience to say that Michael saw things through a largely class perspective, right? There's a Marxist reading throughout all of Michael's work, which which doesn't appear in much of my academic work. So people would be shocked to say, well, why does he talk to him? And in many levels, I would be shocked as well. But Michael showed great support and great friendship for pushing the narrative of my work, when oftentimes that I wouldn't have it either. So, I mean, throughout those times, he was very supportive. So I think that, I'll always be grateful and have gratitude for his friendship for actually getting me over the large amount of imposter syndrome that appeared with early academics. But I think that we had, certainly there was a historical and sociological reading to how people exit from violence. So a lot of my expertise, or my supposed expertise, is around violence to peace transitions. How supposedly, and again, going back to the kernel of why Michael and I hit it off so quickly, was this sort of ahistorical, asociological, apolitical reading of, well, Sunnis just hate Shias in Iraq, and there's no way we could have predicted what happened to Iraq, right? It's quite fundamentally BS. What I look at in my work is showing how these transitions are malleable. How if you reduce instrumentalization from political elites, and there are economic programs, political programs, good leadership, you often see these insurmountable or primordial divisions start to disappear. It's incredibly difficult, obviously, because these elites remain in power, and there are also regional and international interests in places like Iraq that potentially have maybe not a willingness to see division, but certainly maybe in the regional context versus Iran versus Saudi's impact in Iraq, but internationally, not everyone is always playing the game of division, but it's still, they can bumble their way into making a lot of mistakes. However, what I've seen in every grassroots community, whether it's Democratic Republic of Congo, whether it's Burundi, whether it's Northern Ireland or Lebanon or Iraq, at grassroots levels, communities that have been considered by outside actors and outside thought leaders and policy leaders as completely insurmountable, often come together in cooperation. So I think that Michael's interest in my work fundamentally was, how do we create or scale up some of that collaboration and cooperation that can get over decades worth, in some cases, of violence to actually move towards a political program.
And I can't help but think that Michael would have. He was not I don't think that he was a class reductionist, but I think he would argue that on some level, once you mitigate or undercut that instrumentalization, what will be left is a sort of a clearer understanding of a class conflict, and it would you'd have solidarity across those differences that had been instrumentalized and sort of inflamed, I guess, for in service of power. Tell us about his visit to Belfast. What anything of note that we should know, or things that we shouldn't know?
So let it all be public record now.
Sure, exactly.
I will say one last thing on that is that there's Nobel Peace Prize winner, a joint Nobel Peace Prize winner, John Hume, who was a civil rights leader in Northern Ireland and represented the nationalist Republican side of the end of the conflict, had a very famous quote saying that you can't eat a flag, right? So this is something that often sticks with me, and you hear other idioms in East Africa, particularly in Burundi. There's an idiom saying a hungry man is an angry man. And I agree 100%. Michael definitely has been portrayed sometimes, now that he's gone, can't defend himself, but as a class reductionist. But I absolutely never saw that at all. And certainly the understanding of whereas you can't eat a flag, you similarly can't base a national project without one or out some common denominator or human denominator drawing people together. And I think that, anyone who knows Michael just knows how important the emotional, the connectivity between people understanding and having sensitivity and understanding and sympathy and empathy with people was super important. But I will say that the Belfast trip, when I met him in London, and this is something that continued on throughout all of our friendship, was me haranguing him about having time off, right? And I'm sure that anyone close to him probably tried to do the same thing. And I appreciate the direction of travel and the energy that he had, but I was like, I mean, at what point are you going to say, like, a weekend might be enough? Maybe turn off my phone, maybe read a comic, maybe do a lot of different things. So when I met him, he was very tired, and I thought, okay, it's like, can we find a spa or somewhere to like relax? Because we met in London, had a weekend in London, and then went to Belfast. I was like, yeah, sure, no problem. 6 hours later, after he had entered the spa, I wondered if he had fallen into the water and drowned, but thankfully he just needed a very long sleep. But once we got to Belfast, that was the weekend of the Jeffrey Epstein news that had come out during the weekend. So he was completely taken with this the entire time. He's like, right, okay, so at this point, we really need the conspiracy theorists just to take the lead, and we'll not say anything. We'll not feed into it, but just have at it, because this is crazy, right? So I will say one thing that I think that I'm probably professionally beyond at this point, but I arranged with a wonderful podcaster and friend, Connor Habib. So he did Connor Habib's show in my office at Queen's University when I was part of the Senator George Mitchell Institute for Peace. And during that weekend in the Epstein file, or because of the Epstein news, one of the people that had appeared on the Epstein plane originally, or appeared on the list, was Senator George Mitchell. So having gone through the lengths to set up the podcast and have them sit down, and they were recording in a quiet space, they were like, Connor decides to say, well, isn't it interesting that we're sitting in the Senator Mitchell, in the Senator Mitchell, I'm in the background, please, no, shut up. I was like, they'll track it back to me, and I'm fired on the spot. But so apart from escaping the professional consequences of drawing that connection through, it was a great trip. I mean, Michael met my family. We got drunk. We had lots of good food. We had a tour. Often one of the tours in Northern Ireland is that everyone does if they're politically interested, is what they call the Bombs and Bullets tour. So I had a taxi driver in which he was convinced that he was going to create his next character from this taxi driver. And usually they're ex-prisoners from the conflict who usually fought in one side or the other. I'm very fond of the time we managed to spend in Belfast. And also, I should say that it's my fault that he missed his flight initially. So we spent too much time chatting in the morning, and I was late to get him to Belfast, or to Dublin airport. But the great news is that meant that I had an extra 12 hours that I would never get the chance to spend with my friends. So
that's great. Well, Drew, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. If people want to see more of your work, obviously, we'll put links to your appearance on TMBS. But if there's anything else you want folks to check out, where would they go?
Well, I would say that I would probably best advertise my stuff on Twitter whenever the new writing comes out. Unfortunately, not academia having its landlocked system where a lot of articles you can't access, but I do a lot of public op-eds as well. So if you want to reach out and read some of them, then I can send the links on Twitter as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Drew Mikhael. Really appreciate you coming on. It's great to hear from you.
Thank you very much. Left is best.
Thanks, Drew.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Drew.